It's no secret that I'm a huge fan of Double Dragon. When I first played the game back in the late 1980s, it was a game that changed my life. The game was a colossal success in arcades and ended up being ported over to just about every platform you could possibly imagine. You play as Billy and Jimmy Lee, two martial arts masters who are on a mission to rescue Billy's girlfriend Marion from the clutches of some pretty bad dudes who definitely lack subtlety and stealth as far as kidnapping goes. In the Sega Genesis version of Double Dragon, you'll be punching and kicking your way through 4 tough levels on your way to save Marion and defeat the Shadow Warriors. Most people are pretty familiar with the NES version of Double Dragon, but in 1993, Accolade released what may be the best and most arcade-accurate home version on the Genesis. Being that it was released by Accolade, it did have one of those odd-shaped carts, kind of like the EA carts, but a little bit smaller. The Genesis iteration of Double Dragon is as close to the arcade game as you could get at the time. That's not to say that there aren't some differences here and there, but overall it looks and feels just like the original. One thing worth noting right off the bat is how much faster the game seems on the Sega Genesis. Most of that horrid slowdown that plagued the arcade version is absent here, and it does make for a much smoother and less frustrating experience. At times, it still does hiccup here and there when playing with a friend and having a bunch of enemies on screen at once, but still not nearly as bad as the arcade game. Oh yeah, and that does bring me to another great feature on the Genesis version that is weirdly absent from the NES port that most people are so familiar with, and that is excellent 2-player cooperative play. Playing with a friend definitely adds a lot to the game. Another difference that I noticed is that the enemy placement is a bit different. Take for example the Abobo that bursts through the wall in Stage 1. In the arcade, he's a white variant of the sprite, but in the Genesis, it's the same black one that you end up fighting at the end of the level. Actually, now that I think about it, the Genesis version only uses the black one, outside of the green one at the midway point of level 3. It also feels like the enemies in the game have far more health than they did in the arcade game. Some enemies can take a ridiculous amount of punishment before being dispatched, but thankfully the old elbow throwing tactic from the arcade still works like a charm here. Graphically, the game does look awesome on the Sega Genesis. It looks just like the arcade in most aspects, and it should. The original game did come out in 1987. The characters are all the right size and sport the same looks and detail that we've all become accustomed to, but some of the background details are missing and some of them do look a bit different. Take for example the wanted posters on the first level. You can tell that although the Genesis certainly had the horsepower to handle Double Dragon, its limited palette still causes a bit of the background artwork to kind of blend in. Double Dragon's music on the Genesis is great and sounds just like the arcade game in most areas. The sound isn't quite up to par though, since it is missing those bone-crunching hit effects and the small voice samples you hear when taking out enemies or even while dying. The punching and kicking sounds that you hear in the Genesis version sound really generic in comparison to the arcade, but don't worry, it's not enough to detract from the overall experience. The game controls really well on a Genesis controller, since the arcade button scheme consisted of 3 buttons anyway. It's very smooth and very precise. Double Dragon on the Genesis is an awesome port of one of the most influential games that was ever made. This particular version wasn't ever nearly as popular as the NES port, and it just doesn't get the recognition that it deserves. It's easily one of the best ports of Double Dragon that was ever released. If you're a big fan of the series and have never given the Genesis version a shot, do it. It's a game that's timeless and it never stops being fun, even all these years later. It's not terribly easy to find, but it's not really a rare or expensive game either. If you do happen to come across it, definitely grab it up. There was also an excellent version of Double Dragon 2 that was available for the Genesis, but sadly it wasn't ever released stateside. It's a worthy import if you feel like tracking it down, and it can be played on a Genesis 3 with no mod necessary. As always, guys, I'd like to thank all of you for watching and subscribing, and until next time, stay classic.